All right there, everyone. Experts are predicting that the European Union could collapse any time in the next 10 years. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. Well, as Brexit looms over the horizon, it's appearing to be more and more the case that Brexit is frankly the least of the EU's worries. There is, to put it mildly, a rather pronounced disappointment in the EU across the continent, which of course is galvanizing the nationalist populace as they head into the European parliamentary elections in May. Now, the issue that the so-called experts all seem to agree on is that the European Union's push under the leadership of Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the head of the European Commission, under his leadership, there is just this relentless, unyielding push for further integration, further centralization of power in Brussels, less sovereignty from member nations. Remember, we did a video on this. Do you remember what Angela Merkel said not too long ago? She was speaking at some event, I think it was in Berlin, and she actually said out loud for all to hear that the European Union member states needed to be prepared to transfer their powers over to Brussels. You see, I think this is the advantage, well, at least another advantage, we have with Merkel saying her long goodbye as she exits the world stage. The advantage is that for the first time in her entire political career, she's actually stating bluntly what she really believes. I mean, how her party, the Christian Democratic Union, could still be called center-right or conservative, I have no idea. I mean, they don't have a conservative bone in their body. So Merkel came out and said nation states have to be prepared to give up their sovereignty. And again, this was just another echo of French President Macron, who basically said the same thing, that Europe needed to be stronger and win more sovereignty over its member nations. Now, this is key. Back then, when they were talking this way, right, a few weeks back, the concern for both of these defenders of liberal globalism was that, if you remember, the UN Migration Pact was collapsing. I mean, nation after nation was coming out saying, hasta la vista, baby, we ain't signing nothing. I mean, over 20 nations refused to sign it. But what's important is that these kind of blowbacks from those 20-plus nations, or particularly from European member nations, that blowback was only increasing the rhetoric for more centralization and less sovereignty. Now, so this massive disconnect that's opening up between member nations and the elites in Brussels is really beginning to worry experts. It's catching their attention. What they're noticing is that the massive dissatisfaction with the EU, whether it's over the high unemployment experienced by rural areas or whether it's over its lack of border security, its assault on political identity, its complete inflexibility, its sterile standardization, whatever. What pundits are noticing here is that this dissatisfaction with the EU is already being expressed in what they're calling partial exit. Those are the words of Hans Vollard, who's a political science professor over at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. He's noticing an increasing number of nations, we're talking about over a dozen member nations, that are beginning the process not so much of leaving the Union formally or completely, but instead they're beginning to talk about withdrawing from the EU's political system, challenging its laws, its regulations, contributing less to the EU budget, reasserting their sovereignty. And these are, according to Vollard, nothing less than very real, what he calls partial exits by member states from the EU. Another academic, a fellow by the name of Rem Korteweg, he says we're seeing this happening particularly among the Nordic nations, the so-called creditor nations in the north. There's a group of about 8 nations that call themselves the Hanseatic League, and these are the 3 Baltic states, and Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Ireland, and the Netherlands, and these nations are signaling more and more their discomfort with particularly French plans at further integration. And so they've begun to push back by actually looking inward amongst themselves to create their own kind of, Visegrad 4 group, like what we have in Central Europe with Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Not too long ago, the Polish Prime Minister was talking this way. Mateusz Morawiecki is the Prime Minister in Poland. He was speaking at the German Marshall Fund Brussels Forum, and he asserted that the dominance of Germany and France over the European Union really appears to have come to an end, and that a number of member nations are ready to band together and basically form a bloc of de facto Eurosceptic nations that would have the power to stop German and French plans to increase the power of Brussels over member nations. He made it clear that it wasn't just Poland and the rest of the Visegrad Four standing against more EU bureaucracy and regulation and power, but that there were, as of his speech, 12 nations that were prepared to stand united in their opposition against the expansion of Brussels as the primary power among EU nations. Now, 8 of these 12 countries are in the north, and he's referring here to a report issued by these 8 northern European nations that cautioned Merkel and Macron in pursuing what they considered overly ambitious plans for the EU, and they were standing together with the Visegrad Four in Central Europe. Now, to make things even worse for the EU, you now, of course, the whole problem of nationalist populist Italy, with both the Italian League's Matteo Salvini and Five Stars Luigi Di Maio pushing back on Brussels for its unprecedented interference in their domestic budget proposals. Now, if you factor in Eastern European nations and their not so subtle pushbacks against Brussels, particularly its liberalism, then what all this is boiling down to, what you can expect to see happen more and more, is that upwards of more than half the member nations of the EU are in fact instituting at least some kind of partial exit from the Union. Again, it's not a full exit, of course. We're not talking full Brexit, but we're talking several little mini Brexits, the success of which is only going to inspire more nations to act accordingly. But you have some arguing quite openly that these massive fractures from Brussels could in fact bring the whole Union down within 10 years. Now, of course, to make matters even worse, we've talked about this in another video, but it's quite pertinent here. Experts are saying that the EU is so vulnerable right now, again, largely because of these multiple little partial exits, that if there were a major economic downturn, a major recession, that might be it. That might be enough to just have the whole thing collapse. We'll have to see. But needless to say, we'll certainly be keeping our eyes on how things develop, especially leading up to May, the parliamentary elections there, of course. But the thing to keep your eye on is the extent to which we begin seeing these mini or partial exits, where more and more nations begin to turn away from Brussels and actually turn more towards each other in new alliances that maintain national sovereignty while providing mutual economic benefits. That's going to make Brussels all the weaker, and it may just end up dying from the overall amount of these tiny incisions. And we're literally talking the EU bleeding to death within a 10-year time frame. So